Hey guys, what's going on? It's Dave from Evil Eye Games. In today's video, I want to go ahead and talk about multiple GPU setups. And I want to talk about this from both the consumer standpoint as well as a developer standpoint. But before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and point out that I have a link below to my Facebook page. So if you want to follow me on Facebook, you can go ahead and click that link down below. And if you like what I'm making, you can go ahead and hit that subscribe button down below and like the video. If you really hate the video, just go ahead and hit the down thumb button. So if you're already following me on Facebook, you may have noticed that a few days ago or a week ago, I posted some pictures of some changes I made to my PC. Now, I didn't post what my system looked like before that, so I'm going to put up some pictures right now to show you the before and after shots of my system. And probably the biggest change that you're going to notice is that I went from 2 GPUs to 1 GPU. More specifically, I went from 2 GTX 980s to a single 1080. Now, some people out there might be scratching their heads and going, why would you go from 2 980s to a 1080 when in theory and on paper, 2 980s should perform better than a single 1080? And the reality is that there's a lot of cons that go along with using multiple GPU setups. So first, let's talk about the pros. And really, the only pro I have is that you have the potential to get better frame rates. And honestly, that's really it. But the key word in that phrase is potential. When it comes to SLI or Crossfire configurations nowadays, you're basically getting a grab bag of what kind of performance gains you're going to get, if any at all. And that leads us into the cons of having an SLI or a Crossfire configuration. The first and the most predominant is that you're going to be paying twice the price, but you're not going to be getting twice the performance. Now, obviously, there are situations where people will buy a single card and later down the road upgrade to an SLI configuration when the price of their original card drops. But if you're building a new system from scratch, you're basically just doubling the price of your GPU configuration. But no matter what you do, you're never going to get twice the performance. Nowadays, if you're looking at a great SLI or Crossfire situation, you're looking at about a 70% gain for twice the price once again. And to be honest, that really doesn't seem like a fair trade-off. Now, aside from doubling the price, you're also going to double the amount of power that your graphics setup is going to consume, as well as doubling the amount of heat that your graphics setup is going to produce. So you're going to have to ensure that you have a power supply that can handle both of the GPUs as well as the rest of the system. And on top of that, if you're generating more heat in the system, you're going to have a way to dissipate that heat and get it out of your case. Now, if you're going the standard route and air cooling your cards, that means you're going to have to make sure that there's adequate airflow in your case, which might mean spending more on fans or a case that provides more airflow. And if you're like me in water cooling, that means you're going to have to make sure that you have enough radiator space to dissipate the heat generated by both of those cards, as well as whatever else you're water cooling. So choosing to go down the SLI route can prove to be significantly more expensive than choosing a single card that is more powerful. The other thing you're going to have to contend with is the fact that not all games are going to support SLI or Crossfire. One very particular example right now is the Windows Store. And if for some reason you ever want to buy a game on the Windows Store, it will never ever support SLI or Crossfire. Additionally, a lot of games that are from smaller development companies and indie studios are not going to implement SLI support. Now, you can manually turn on SLI support, but in a lot of cases, at least from my experience in the games that I've played, it's actually going to make the game perform worse. There are plenty of games that I've loaded up with SLI on, found the performance to be subpar, turned off SLI, and found that they ran better on a single card. And essentially, this just comes down to either lacking support or having a really poor implementation of SLI. And you're probably thinking, well, if I play mostly AAA or big studio games, I won't have to deal with that. Reality is that most games don't launch with SLI support when they come out. So if you're excited about a new game coming out, chances are it's probably not going to support SLI for some time after the game launches. you could be waiting anywhere from a week to a month or maybe even longer just to see adequate SLI support put into place so that you can utilize both of those cards. In the meantime, you're basically stuck using one card and only using half of what you paid for. And when it comes to the performance gains of SLI, like I mentioned before, it's kind of a grab bag. And this 980 setup wasn't my first SLI configuration. I've actually had SLI setups prior to this with a pair of 970s and a pair of 770s. And if anything that I've noticed is that, simply put, the support for SLI games is getting worse. And this can be attributed to both the developers making the game and NVIDIA itself. And if you've been watching the news on NVIDIA, when they started out with their 10 series lineup, they made the announcement that they're not going to be supporting anything above 2A SLI, although you can technically get around that. But it's a big indicator that NVIDIA isn't really that interested in supporting SLI that much anymore. And probably the biggest reason that I ended up switching over from a dual card setup to a single card setup comes down to the phenomenon known as micro stutter. Now, some people are going to be more sensitive to micro stutter than other people. In my particular case, I'm actually very sensitive to it. And while playing some games, I would perceive the game as dropping down, and it would look to me like the game was running at something like sub 30 frames per second. And I would end up turning on something like Fraps to see what kind of frame rate I was actually getting. And even though I perceive the game as running at under 30 frames per second, the game would actually be running at 60 or 70 frames per second or even higher. And microstutter basically occurs when the time frame between each consecutively drawn frame varies a great deal. So if you have something that draws frame 1 and it takes it 10 milliseconds to draw that frame, frame 2 gets drawn, but it takes 30 milliseconds to draw that frame. Then frame 3 comes out, and it only takes 10 milliseconds to draw that frame. And let's say frame 4 comes out, and it takes it 45 milliseconds. The draw times in between all these frames are so inconsistent, it creates an illusion of having a slower frame rate because the frames that are drawn in quick succession of each other are kind of sandwiched together and spaced apart. And to me, this was really a deal breaker when it came to SLI. And honestly, I'd only started experiencing that in the last couple of years. And it's something that essentially just got progressively worse with newer games coming out. So from a consumer standpoint, I can't honestly recommend an SLI configuration really under any circumstance. I mean, sure, a lot of people go ahead and they get that SLI card to make their systems look awesome because 2 cards look more awesome and fill up more space in the case than 1. And you have the potential for getting better frame rates when you're playing your games. But honestly, there really isn't a lot to weigh against the cons. So me, myself, I would never ever recommend SLI to any consumer out there. Then we also have the concerns from the developer standpoint. So not only does NVIDIA and AMD have to implement how SLI actually works on the hardware level, but the game developers also have to basically write in code in order to get their game to take advantage of those SLI and Crossfire configurations. So this process is going to require extra time and extra money because you got to pay developers in order to implement this. Now, I mentioned before that even with AAA games, you're going to have situations where the SLI support doesn't come out for weeks or months after the game launches. And the reality about this is the fact that if you remember back from my video on optimization, the most common hardware configuration out there are people with single cards that are going to be between $150 and $200. Most consumers don't have SLI configurations, and the difference between buying 2 $200 cards and buying a single $400 card, there's really no reason to SLI because of the additional expenses that you have to take into account when creating a system for SLI. So at the end of the day, multi-GPU setups are not a priority for major developers. Now, most of them will eventually go ahead and add in SLI support, but they're not going to devote the time and the resources to make it work the best that it could. Then when it comes to smaller developers and indie developers, those developers are really not going to touch SLI or Crossfire whatsoever. Because once again, it takes time and it takes money to go ahead and implement those things. And when a developer has much tighter budget constraints, they're not going to waste their time on something that their game can't even really take advantage of. Actually, if I think about it, I can't think of a single game engine that I know of that takes advantage of SLI or Crossfire by default. So this is going to mean the smaller developer and even the larger developers are going to have to invest that time and the money in order to make SLI and Crossfire work. And for smaller companies, this just isn't going to be worth it to them. Usually, in most cases, their games are not going to drive a system so hard that it can actually benefit from a multiple GPU setup. So at the end of the day, you're paying double for not double the performance and something that nobody is particularly interested in supporting. Now, the only one possible case that I can think of that would sort of re-energize the SLI or Crossfire market is when it comes to VR. And I plan on doing a video on VR in the future. But for the scope of this video, really, VR requires very high frame rates and it requires very consistent frame rates in order to avoid side effects like motion sickness and other things associated with using VR headsets that are available now. So that's going to require a significantly more powerful graphics situation than with just playing on a gaming monitor. But all in all, really, unless you're doing something very specific that is going to take advantage of multiple GPUs and it's going to be worth spending that extra money, there really isn't a whole lot of reason to, as a consumer, purchase an SLI configuration, and from a developer standpoint, implement SLI or Crossfire in their game. So that's going to complete today's video, guys. If you have any questions or comments, you can go ahead and leave them down below. And as always, thanks for watching.